I never thought my life would unravel because of a single sentence. But sometimes that's all it takes, one line that tears through years of love, loyalty, and sacrifice. My name is Elena. I'm 32 years old, and if you had met me a year ago, you would have thought I had it all figured out. A steady job as a project manager, a small but cozy home that I decorated with secondhand finds and splashes of color, and a relationship that at least on the surface looked stable. But under that surface, fault lines had been forming, and I was too blind, too in love, or maybe too hopeful to see them. The sentence came on a Tuesday evening. I had just come back from work exhausted, but content, carrying groceries in one arm and my laptop bag in the other. He was sitting on the couch staring at his phone, that blank expression on his face that always made me uneasy. I asked him if everything was okay, and he didn't even look at me when he said it. My therapist says you're the source of my anxiety. At first I thought he was joking. I even laughed a dry, confused little chuckle. But then I saw the way his hands tightened around his phone, the way his lips pressed together like he was sealing a coffin. He meant it. That was his truth. And in that moment, I felt my chest hollow out, as if someone had carved my ribs open and scooped away everything soft inside. It wasn't just the words, it was what they carried. Because I had been his anchor for 4 years. I had been the one holding him when his father died, the one who stayed awake at 2 a.m. while he spiraled over work deadlines, the one who paid rent when his passion projects didn't bring in money. And now I was being told that I was his problem, that my love, my existence, my very presence was poison to him. I wanted to argue, to scream, to demand he take it back. But all I managed to say was, "I see." It came out flat, almost robotic. My voice didn't sound like mine anymore. Then without another word I went into the bedroom, pulled a suitcase from under the bed and started folding clothes. He didn't move. Didn't ask me to stop. Didn't fight for me. And maybe that was the deepest cut of all. By the time I zipped up the bag, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely close it. I left a note on the kitchen counter, 2 lines in my messy handwriting. Problem solved. You're welcome. Then I walked out of the apartment we'd shared, and with it, I walked out of the version of myself that had once believed in us. But walking away doesn't erase the pain. If anything, it sharpens it. The first night I stayed at my friend Maya's place, curled on her couch while she stroked my hair like I was a child. I didn't cry. The tears wouldn't come yet. Instead, I stared at the ceiling in the dark and replayed every memory, every laugh, every kiss, trying to map how we had gone from lovers to strangers so quickly. The cruel part is that the answer wasn't quick at all. It had been unraveling for months. He had started therapy 8 months ago, and I had been the one to encourage it. I thought it would help him cope with his grief, his work, stress, his demons. And at first it seemed to. He came home lighter, talking about boundaries and self-care. But slowly those sessions stopped being about him and became about me. My reminders about dishes in the sink, control issues. My concern when he stayed out all night without texting, toxic attachment. My asking about money when I was paying most of the bills, financial manipulation. It was as if every part of me was being dissected and labeled as pathology, like I was no longer a girlfriend, but a diagnosis, a symptom, a trigger. He stopped seeing me as a person, and started seeing me as the villain in his therapy narrative, and I let it happen. That's the part that haunts me. I let myself shrink, second-guess, apologize for things that weren't wrong. I walked on eggshells in my own home, too afraid that any word out of place would be twisted into another reason why I was toxic. By the time he finally said the sentence out loud, maybe he wasn't even wrong. I was the source of his anxiety, but only because he had turned me into a scapegoat for everything he didn't want to face in himself. The text started less than 24 hours later. Angry at first, then pleading, then desperate. He said he didn't mean it like that his therapist had miscommunicated. He said I couldn't just leave, that I was overreacting. But I had spent months being accused of overreacting, and I knew this wasn't that. This was clarity. Painful, burning clarity. Still, even clarity doesn't heal you overnight. That first week, I oscillated between numbness and rage. I wanted to scream at him, to burn every photo, to shatter the mugs we'd bought together on that trip to the coast. But I also wanted him to call me and say it was all a mistake, that he needed me, that I was his safe place after all. Betrayal has a way of making you crave the very hand that wounded you. What I didn't know yet was that leaving was only the beginning. Because the real story wasn't about him telling me I was the source of his anxiety. It was about what came after, what he did to destroy me, what I uncovered about the lies he had been weaving behind my back, and how the truth, when it finally surfaced, would burn more ferociously than any therapist's words ever could. The second week after I left him was when everything started to shift from heartbreak into something darker, something that reeked of betrayal and manipulation. At first, I thought I had made my escape clean, that he would just let me go, nurse his wounded pride, and eventually move on. But people like him rarely let go so easily. When your entire narrative depends on someone else being the villain, you don't just release them. You try to keep them tethered, to keep the story alive. It began with texts, dozens of them pouring into my blocked inbox from different numbers. The tone swung wildly. Anger 1 hour, declarations of love the next. "You're abandoning me. We can work this out. My therapist says walking away like this proves you're unstable." And then, almost laughably, "I miss you. Please come home." The contradiction should have made me roll my eyes, but instead they filled me with a sick sense of dread. Because beneath all of it I could hear the unspoken truth: he wasn't sorry for what he'd said. He was only sorry that I had finally stopped playing my part in his performance. But the texts weren't the worst part. It was when my phone rang at work, an unfamiliar number, a clipped professional voice introducing herself as Dr. Whitlock, his therapist. My stomach turned to ice as she explained she was concerned about my sudden departure and suggested I consider seeking therapy for abandonment tendencies. She couched it in polite language, but I could feel the accusation in every syllable. The woman who was supposed to help him heal was now extending her claws into my life, branding me as the problem even outside the relationship. I hung up on her, shaking. That night I stared at my reflection in Maya's bathroom mirror and whispered out loud, "This is not my fault." I needed to hear it in my own voice to reclaim it. But my whisper sounded weak, drowned out by the echo of their voices, his, hers, the endless chorus that told me I was toxic, controlling the source of everything rotten. And then came the messages from his mother. At first they were sympathetic, almost kind. "He's hurting Elena. He didn't mean it. You know how sensitive he is." But soon they curdled into guilt trips. "You've abandoned him in his time of need. He gave you 4 years of his life, and this is how you repay him." She framed it like I had walked away from a sick child, not a grown man who had cast me as the villain in his fantasy. It would have been easier to crumble if I didn't start to see cracks in their story. A mutual acquaintance, someone who worked at the same wellness center where he coached, reached out to me quietly. She said she'd overheard him bragging about how therapy had given him language to keep Elena in line, how every fight we had could be reframed as my pathology. The words hit me like a slap. It wasn't just careless, it was deliberate. He had weaponized therapy, twisted it into a shield and a sword until I was cornered with no defense. But karma has a way of peeling back the mask, doesn't it? Through the grapevine, I started hearing whispers about how he had been seeing someone else during those months he claimed to be working on himself. A woman from one of his mindfulness workshops, young and wide-eyed, the kind of person who would swoon at his talk of energy alignment and spiritual awakening. At first, I didn't want to believe it. Betrayal was already choking me. Did I really need to add infidelity on top of it? But then I saw it with my own eyes. A tagged photo on social media, him leaning too close to her in a cafe, his hand resting on hers in a way that was unmistakable. The caption read, "Surrounding myself with healing energy." My healing energy had been traded in for hers just like that, and suddenly, the puzzle pieces slammed into place. Of course I had to be the source of his anxiety. Of course I had to be painted as toxic. Because villains make convenient shadows in which new romances can bloom. I wish I could say I raged immediately, that I stormed to his door and confronted him. But the truth is I sat on Maya's couch and went very, very still. Numb. The betrayal wasn't just that he cheated, it was that he'd tried to rewrite my entire existence, convince me I was poison while planting flowers in someone else's garden. It was psychological warfare dressed up as therapy, and I had been naive enough to play along. But here's the thing about me: when the numbness breaks, it doesn't dissolve into helplessness. It sharpens into resolve. And sitting there staring at that photo, I realized I didn't just want to walk away clean anymore. I wanted the truth to come out. I wanted every mask he wore to crack, every person he manipulated to see him for who he really was. The first step was silence. I stopped defending myself to anyone, his mother, his friends, even mutual acquaintances who asked me what had happened. I gave them nothing. Because silence, I realized, is louder than any justification. And in that silence, the stories started to unravel on their own. His lies couldn't stand without me there to play the counterpoint. And while I stayed silent, I began to gather screenshots of his texts, notes from the calls, the voicemail his mother left begging me to support him financially while he healed. Even the therapist's message saved and dated proof of the lines they crossed. It was meticulous, deliberate. Not out of spite, though. God knows spite burned in me, but out of something colder, something closer to justice. Because I had a feeling this wasn't the end of the story. No, this was only the prologue. Type continued to receive the next part. Banda noi continue chat GPT noi. The third week was when the storm truly broke. I thought I'd already felt the worst of it. The texts, the therapist's intrusion, his mother's guilt trips. But betrayal has layers, and every time I thought I'd reached the bottom, another layer of rot revealed itself. It started with a knock at Maya's door. She wasn't home, so I answered it, and there stood his friend Theo. We'd known each other casually enough to exchange pleasantries at parties, but never more than that. He looked uncomfortable, like he'd rather be anywhere else, and I braced myself for another lecture, another attempt to drag me back into his orbit. Instead, Theo handed me a manila envelope. "You should see this," he said quietly, his eyes darting away. I can't watch him keep doing this to people." Then he turned and left before I could ask questions. Inside were printouts, screenshots, emails, even a few handwritten notes. My hands shook as I spread them across the kitchen table. It was all their messages between him and the new girl, mocking me, bragging about how easy it was to flip the narrative. Emails to his therapist painting me as unstable, manipulative, borderline abusive. Notes that looked like journal entries but read like scripts for pity plays, complete with lines like, "If she leaves, tell people she was paranoid about control." He hadn't just stumbled into blaming me, he'd engineered it, crafted it like a performance with his therapist and his friends as the unwitting audience. And the most chilling part? There was a page where he'd listed my vulnerabilities. Things I'd confessed to him late at night, raw and unguarded: my fear of abandonment after my father left, the anxiety that gnawed at me when bills piled too high, the way I sometimes over-apologized, because deep down I never felt enough. He had cataloged them like weapons. My insecurities, my scars reduced to ammunition in his war. For the first time since I left, I cried, not the angry tears I'd been expecting, but deep, broken sobs that shook my whole body. I cried for the years I gave him, for the love I wasted, for the trust I laid at his feet, only for him to trample. But beneath the grief, something else flickered awake. A spark of rage, hot and unrelenting. I wasn't just going to survive this, I was going to expose him. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. A week later, I got a call from my boss. Apparently, he'd contacted my workplace, spinning some story about how I'd abandoned him, left him destitute, and that my emotional instability might be affecting my job performance. My boss thankfully trusted me enough to see through it, but he urged me to be careful. "He's trying to ruin you, Elena," he said. "People like that don't stop until they've destroyed something." That was the moment I stopped playing defense. I compiled everything: Theo's envelope, my screenshots, the voicemail from his mother, even the therapist's inappropriate message. I put it all in a file and sent it not to him, not to his mother, but to the clinic where his therapist worked, to a few trusted colleagues who knew me well, to the landlord whose name was still attached to the lease he was trying to pin on me. I didn't add commentary. I didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself. And then silence. For days I heard nothing. No texts, no calls, no late-night voicemails from his mother. It was as if the universe was holding its breath waiting for the fallout. And then, like clockwork, the cracks began to show. The clinic reached out first, thanking me for the documentation and confirming they were looking into serious ethical concerns. Word trickled back through mutual acquaintances that he was furious, raging about how I'd sabotaged his healing. But the truth was finally bleeding through, and people were beginning to see him for who he really was. And then came the biggest blow of all: the new girl. I didn't know her personally, but one evening I received a message request on Instagram. My hands trembled as I opened it, half expecting venom. Instead, it was a paragraph that began with, "I think you deserve to know the truth." She told me everything. How he'd courted her with stories of his toxic ex, how he painted himself as the victim, how she'd believed him, until she found the same lists I had tucked into a drawer. Vulnerabilities, scripts, narratives. Only this time my name wasn't the only one written down. There were others. Women before me. Women who had been cast in the same role I had, villains in his performance, scapegoats for his chaos. "He doesn't love," she wrote at the end. "He consumes, and I don't want to be consumed." Reading her words was like staring into a mirror I hadn't known existed. I wasn't the first. I wouldn't have been the last. But at least now I wasn't alone. That night, as I sat in the quiet of Maya's living room, the city humming faintly outside the window, I felt something shift inside me. For weeks I had been defined by what he'd done to me, his betrayal, his narrative, his lies. But now I was holding the truth in my hands. And the truth was heavier, sharper, more powerful than any story he could spin. I didn't know exactly how this war would end, but I knew one thing for certain: he had underestimated me. He thought I would break. Instead, I was about to rise. The weeks that followed were a blur of revelations, each one more bitter than the last. I thought betrayal was a clean wound, a sharp slice you could stitch up with time. But it turned out to be more like infection. It spread, it seeped, it poisoned everything it touched, until I no longer knew where my hurt ended and his lies began. The new girl and I exchanged a few more messages. She didn't owe me anything, yet she gave me details I never would have uncovered alone. He had fed her the same lines he once fed me, almost word for word, as if he was recycling a script. Promises of healing together, long rants about how his ex-me was toxic, and controlling a sob story about how he was constantly misunderstood. I could almost hear his voice in the words she typed, that low, deliberate tone he always used when he wanted to sound wise instead of cruel. But what broke me most wasn't the overlap. It was the escalation. With her, he'd been bolder, more manipulative. He'd used my private pain stories I'd trusted him with about my childhood, my fears, even my nightmares, and passed them off as anecdotes about his own suffering, twisting my wounds into his arsenal. I wasn't just his scapegoat. I was his raw material. He was building sympathy for himself out of the wreckage of me. The fury that boiled up inside me was like nothing I'd ever felt before. I wasn't just angry at him. I was angry at myself for loving him, for ignoring the red flags, for mistaking his neediness for vulnerability and his cruelty for honesty. And underneath that anger there was something even heavier: shame. Shame that I had given so much of myself to someone who only wanted to hollow me out. Shame that I had believed even for a moment that I was the source of his anxiety, when all along he had been the storm tearing me down. Maya noticed the change in me. One night, as we sat on her balcony with mugs of tea cooling between our palms, she looked at me and said, "You've stopped crying." "I think I ran out of tears," I whispered. "No," she said softly, her eyes steady on mine. "You ran out of illusions, and that's stronger." It was around that time that his mother reappeared. Not in person, thank God, but in the form of a letter slipped under Maya's door. A thick envelope written in her careful looping script. She begged me to reconsider, claimed her son was falling apart, that he was drinking too much, that he couldn't sleep. She wrote about how I had been the best thing that ever happened to him, how she still thought of me as a daughter. And then, like poison at the bottom of the glass, she added, "Surely you can support him financially, at least for a little while, until he's stable again." I laughed when I read it. A raw, bitter laugh that startled even me. Support him financially. The man who had branded me toxic, the man who had humiliated me, cheated on me, gaslit me into believing I was the problem. The audacity was almost comical, but it wasn't just audacity, it was entitlement. A family built on excuses, on shifting blame, on finding someone else to carry the burden. And for years I had been that someone. Not anymore. I didn't respond to the letter. Instead, I tucked it into the growing file of evidence I'd been keeping. Because by then I had made a decision: if he or his family tried to drag me down further, I wouldn't just defend myself, I would expose them. All of them. And I wouldn't need to embellish a single detail. The truth was damning enough. The chance came sooner than I expected. A mutual friend reached out, someone who had heard whispers of his version of the story. She asked gently if it was true that I had been manipulative, that I had abandoned him without warning. For a moment the shame surged again. The instinct to defend myself, to soften the edges, to apologize for things I hadn't done. But then I stopped. And instead of excuses, I sent her screenshots. The therapist's text. His mocking messages. The list of my vulnerabilities catalogued like weapons. The truth unfiltered. Her response was immediate. "Elena, I had no idea. He made it sound so different. I'm so sorry." That was when I realized the tide was turning. Slowly, quietly, people were beginning to see through him. Not because I shouted louder, but because I let his own words condemn him. Still, the final blow hadn't fallen yet. And I didn't have to wait long. It was a Saturday when I got the call. His therapist, Dr. Whitlock, had been suspended. An investigation was underway after multiple complaints, mine among them. Lines had been crossed, ethics violated. The clinic wasn't giving me details, but I didn't need them. I knew enough. He had tried to weaponize therapy, and now the weapon had backfired. I hung up the phone and sat very still. For the first time in months, I felt something that wasn't grief or rage. I felt relief. The kind that seeps into your bones, that tells you maybe, just maybe, the worst is over. But I also knew better than to trust relief. Because men like him don't vanish quietly. And sure enough, before the week was out, I would learn the darkest secret of all. One that went beyond betrayal, beyond manipulation, straight into the heart of family secrets I had never imagined. The kind of secret that changes everything. I thought I had unearthed the worst of it. That the therapist's suspension, the exposure of his manipulation, the unraveling of his lies, those were the closing notes of this nightmare. But betrayal rarely ends where you expect it to. Sometimes it digs deeper, reaching into places you didn't even know were vulnerable. And in my case, it reached all the way into the bones of my family. It started with a phone call from my mother. She had been quiet through most of the chaos, choosing not to take sides, though I could hear the worry in her voice every time we spoke. That night, her tone was different, heavy, hesitant. "Elena," she said, "there's something you need to know." At first, I braced myself for pity. I thought she was about to tell me again that I deserved better, that I should focus on healing. But instead, she told me a story I had never heard before. About my father. I had grown up believing my father left because he fell out of love with my mother. That he moved to another state, remarried, started a new life because ours wasn't enough. I had carried that wound for decades, the scar of abandonment shaping everything I feared in relationships. But that night, my mother confessed the truth. He hadn't simply left. He had been pushed, manipulated. My uncle, her brother, had convinced him that my mother was unfaithful, that I might not even be his child. Lies whispered in the right ears, twisted truths. And eventually a family fractured beyond repair. I sat there in stunned silence, her words rattling through me, and then she added almost in a whisper, "The way your ex treated you, the things he said. It's the same pattern, Elena. History repeating itself." It was as though the universe had pulled back a curtain. The betrayal I suffered wasn't just mine, it was an echo, a thread woven into my bloodline. My father had been deceived into believing lies about the woman he loved. And decades later, I had been cast in the same role, accused of being the problem, branded toxic, abandoned not by accident but by design. For days I couldn't shake the thought, maybe I was never meant to escape this cycle. Maybe betrayal was my inheritance. But the anger that rose in me said otherwise. I refused to let this be my legacy. I began digging. If my uncle's lies had shattered my parents, what else had been hidden? Late nights turned into research sessions, old letters pulled from dusty boxes, fragments of emails pieced together. And slowly I discovered the full story. My uncle hadn't just manipulated my father, he had also stolen from him money from a joint business, siphoned under the guise of helping, betrayal layered on betrayal masked by family loyalty. And suddenly I saw it all clearly. My ex and my uncle, they were the same kind of man. Men who thrived on twisting narratives, who needed scapegoats to hide their own shadows, who weaponized love and trust until it broke the women who gave it. The realization didn't crush me, it fueled me. If this pattern was generational, then I would be the one to end it. The chance came in the most unexpected way. My ex, desperate after the collapse of his reputation, had reached out to my mother. He knew she was gentle, forgiving. He knew she worried about me. And in his arrogance he thought she would plead on his behalf. But instead she called me. He said, "You ruined him," she told me. "That you destroyed his career." But Elena, I believed him for 5 minutes. And then I remembered your father. I remembered the lies. And I told him I wouldn't let another man break my daughter the way my brother broke me. I felt tears sting my eyes. Not of grief this time, but of something close to vindication. For the first time, my mother wasn't protecting me from pain, she was standing with me in it. That night, I went to bed with a strange calm. Because I understood now that this wasn't just about my failed relationship. It was about reclaiming the narrative that had been stolen from me long before I met him. It was about facing betrayal not as a victim, but as someone who could finally say no more. But life, cruel as it is, wasn't done testing me. Because just as I thought I was closing the chapter, a message arrived from an unfamiliar email. A single line that made my blood run cold. "You don't know the whole story. Ask him about your uncle." The world tilted beneath me. What did my ex have to do with the uncle who shattered my family decades ago? What thread tied them together? My hands shook as I stared at the message, my heart pounding with dread and a sick kind of curiosity. Because if what I suspected was true, the betrayal ran deeper than I ever imagined. And I knew then that the final confrontation was coming. I didn't sleep that night. The email pulsed in my mind like a live wire, sparking dread and fury in equal measure. "Ask him about your uncle." The words twisted together two betrayals that had always felt separate, my shattered childhood and my broken relationship, and now they were threads of the same rope tightening around my throat. By morning I couldn't stand the weight of not knowing. Against every instinct for self-preservation, I called him. My hands trembled as the phone rang, my chest tight, with the knowledge that I was walking back into the fire I had fought so hard to escape. He answered on the third ring, his voice thick with exhaustion and bitterness. "Elena," he said, as though my name was a curse and a prayer at once. I cut straight to it. "What do you know about my uncle?" There was silence, the kind that confirms guilt before words ever do. Then he laughed, a low, hollow sound that made my skin crawl. "So he finally told you," he muttered. "Or maybe someone else did." The truth spilled out in fragments, each one cutting deeper than the last. My ex hadn't stumbled into my life by coincidence. He had known my uncle. They had met at some retreat years ago. Two men bonded over their resentment of women who had wronged them. My uncle, bitter and unrepentant, had fed him stories about my family, about me long before we ever met. He painted me as the daughter of betrayal, tainted by my mother's supposed sins. When my ex found me, it wasn't love at first sight. It was curiosity, an experiment. Could he confirm the narrative my uncle had given him? Could he twist me into proving the cycle true? I felt my stomach turn as he admitted it, no remorse in his voice. "At first, I just wanted to see if it was real. If you were really as controlling, as toxic as he said. And then when you loved me anyway, it was almost disappointing. So I pushed harder. I wanted to see how far you'd break." My vision blurred with tears, but my voice came out sharp as glass. "So I was never your partner. I was your project. You were inevitable," he said simply. That was the final fracture. The moment when every last thread of love I had ever felt for him snapped and turned to ash. He wasn't just a cruel man. He was a generational echo carrying my uncle's poison into my life, determined to make me wear the same scars my mother bore. I hung up without another word. For hours I sat in silence, my mind a storm. Betrayal, I realized, wasn't just an event. It was a legacy passed down like an heirloom no one wanted. But I also knew something else: legacies can be broken. Patterns can end. and I refused to let these men define me, to let their lies echo forward into whatever future I still had. So I acted. I took the file I had built, the screenshots, the voicemails, the therapist's unethical messages, even the new girl's testimony, and I added this revelation. I wrote a statement, raw and unfiltered, about the generational abuse, about how manipulation had masqueraded as love for too long. Then I shared it. With my family, with trusted friends, with the clinic still investigating him. Even eventually on a private forum for survivors of psychological abuse. And in the sharing I found something I hadn't felt in years: power. People reached out, not with pity but with recognition. Women who had been through the same cycles. Strangers who saw themselves in my story. Even my father, the man I thought had abandoned me, called me after my mother forwarded him what I'd written. His voice shook as he told me the truth. He had never stopped loving me. He had just believed the lies. And now finally he saw through them. It wasn't revenge in the cinematic sense. There were no explosions, no dramatic confrontations and crowded rooms. But it was justice. My ex's reputation crumbled as the truth spread. His therapist lost her license. My uncle's name, once shielded by family silence, was dragged into the light. And me, I walked out of the ashes scarred but unbroken. Looking back now, I don't see myself as the victim of betrayal anymore. I see myself as the one who ended it. The one who said enough. The one who refused to pass the inheritance of lies to another generation. So if you take anything from my story, let it be this. Betrayal does not define you. It reveals them. And when someone tells you that you are the source of their chaos, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to step away and let them drown in the storm they created. If you've listened this far, thank you for holding the story with me. If it resonated, please like, share, and subscribe. It helps me know these words found the hearts they were meant for. And if you've ever carried a wound like mine, leave a comment. Your story deserves to be heard too.